It was a bright, ordinary morning at Lincoln Heights Middle School, the kind of day where the hum of students filled the hallways and the scent of freshly sharpened pencils lingered in the air. The bell had just rung, signaling the start of third period, and students shuffled into classrooms with the usual mix of enthusiasm and reluctance. In one particular classroom, however, the energy was different, almost tense. Mrs. Carmichael, the teacher, stood at the front of the room with her hands on her hips, scanning the rows of desks with an air of authority. The students knew she didn't tolerate much nonsense. Her sharp tone and no-nonsense demeanor often made her the topic of whispers in the lunchroom. But today, her eyes landed on a boy sitting near the back of the room. He had a confident posture, an easy smile, and the kind of energy that seemed to light up the space around him. He wasn't disruptive, far from it, but there was something about him that clearly rubbed Mrs. Carmichael the wrong way. "Brandon," she called, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the class. "What is going on with your hair today?" The boy looked up, puzzled, as he ran his hand over his short, neatly styled curls. "Nothing, ma'am," he replied politely, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "It's just my hair." Mrs. Carmichael's lips tightened. "It looks unkempt. Distracting. I've told this class time and time again that appearances matter, especially in a learning environment. You can't expect to be taken seriously looking like that." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Brandon's classmates glanced at each other, unsure of what to do or say. They could feel the tension building, and even those who didn't usually pay attention had their focus locked on the exchange. Brandon shifted in his seat, his smile faltering as he tried to process what was happening. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I don't understand what's wrong with my hair." Mrs. Carmichael let out a frustrated sigh and grabbed a glue stick from her desk. "If you won't take responsibility for presenting yourself properly," she said, "then maybe I need to make an example out of you." The room fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. Everyone watched, frozen, as Mrs. Carmichael walked briskly to Brandon's desk. Before anyone could react, she unscrewed the cap of the glue stick and began running it through his hair. "You see, class," she said as she worked, her tone cool and matter-of-fact, "this is what happens when you refuse to follow basic standards. It's a lesson in accountability." Brandon sat there, stunned, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. The laughter that Mrs. Carmichael might have expected from the class didn't come. Instead, there was only silence. Even the students who usually reveled in classroom drama knew this was different. This wasn't funny. This wasn't right. One girl in the front row finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Carmichael," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling, "I don't think you're allowed to do that." Mrs. Carmichael straightened up, glaring at the girl. "And I don't think it's your place to tell me how to run my classroom," she snapped. "Let this be a reminder to all of you, respect and discipline matter. When you step outside these walls, the world isn't going to give you any handouts." Brandon's face burned with humiliation, but he refused to cry. He sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, as Mrs. Carmichael returned to her desk. The glue was drying in his hair, sticky and uncomfortable, but the physical sensation was nothing compared to the emotional weight crushing him. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, and no matter how much he tried to act like it didn't bother him, the shame was unbearable. As soon as class ended, Brandon grabbed his backpack and bolted out of the room. He didn't stop until he was in the boys' bathroom, where he locked himself in a stall and tried to scrub the glue out with water. But no matter how hard he rubbed, the mess only seemed to get worse. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, his heart pounding, and wondered what he was supposed to do now. He couldn't go home like this. He couldn't let his friends see him like this. But most of all, he couldn't face his dad. Brandon's father wasn't just any dad. He was the principal of Lincoln Heights Middle School, a man known for his kindness, fairness, and unshakable sense of justice. The students loved him, the teachers respected him, and the community admired him. Brandon had always been proud of his dad, But now, he wasn't sure how to tell him what had happened. He didn't want to disappoint him, or make him feel like he'd failed to protect his own son. Still, as the minutes ticked by, Brandon knew he couldn't avoid the truth forever. With a heavy sigh, he pulled out his phone and texted his dad, "Can we talk?" "It's important." It didn't take long for his dad to reply, "Of course. Meet me in my office after your last class." Brandon's stomach churned as he made his way to the principal's office later that afternoon. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and every step felt like it echoed louder than the last. When he finally reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. "Come in," his dad's familiar voice called from inside. Brandon pushed the door open and stepped inside, his heart pounding. His dad was sitting at his desk, reviewing some paperwork, but he looked up immediately when he saw Brandon. His warm smile faded as his eyes landed on the mess in Brandon's hair. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with concern. Brandon hesitated, his throat tightening. He didn't want to cry, but the weight of everything that had happened that day was too much to hold back. "It was Mrs. Carmichael," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said my hair was distracting. And then she put glue in it." For a moment, his dad didn't say anything. He just stared at Brandon, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stood up from his desk and walked around to where Brandon was standing. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is not okay. Not by any standard." Brandon looked up at his dad, relief and gratitude washing over him. He had been so afraid of disappointing him, but instead, he felt nothing but support and love. "What are we going to do?" Brandon asked, his voice trembling. His dad's expression hardened, a rare glimpse of the sternness that only came out when he was truly angry. "We're going to handle this the right way," he said. "But I need you to trust me and be patient." "Can you do that?" Brandon nodded, his faith in his dad unwavering. As they sat down together to talk through what had happened, the weight on Brandon's chest began to lift. He didn't know exactly what his dad had planned, but he knew one thing for sure: Mrs. Carmichael had made a big mistake. She had underestimated the boy sitting in her classroom, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. And neither, it seemed, did the rest of the school. The next morning, Brandon woke up with a knot in his stomach. His dad had insisted he stay home for the day while he dealt with the situation, but Brandon couldn't shake the fear of what would come next. What if Mrs. Carmichael twisted the story? What if his classmates believed her? He hated the idea of being talked about, his name whispered in hallways and scribbled in texts. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cereal he had no appetite for. His dad was on the phone in the next room, his voice low and steady. Brandon couldn't make out the words, but he could tell by the tone that the conversation was serious. Every so often, his dad would pause, letting the other person speak, before responding in that measured way of his. "Brandon," his dad called after a while, stepping into the kitchen. His tie was perfectly knotted, his suit sharp, but there was a tension in his expression that made Brandon's chest tighten. "I need to head into the school for a meeting. I'll be back later, and we'll talk more then." "Try to relax, okay?" Brandon nodded, but he didn't feel any better. He watched his dad grab his briefcase and head out the door, the sound of the car starting up lingering long after the engine had faded down the street. Meanwhile, back at school, the atmosphere was charged. Word about the incident had spread faster than anyone expected, whispered from one student to the next, until nearly everyone knew. The story had morphed as it traveled, with some saying Mrs. Carmichael had glued Brandon's entire head and others claiming she'd shouted insults. In the teacher's lounge, the staff was abuzz with their own version of the story. Most were horrified, though a few defended Mrs. Carmichael, insisting she must have had her reasons. But there was an undercurrent of unease and unspoken acknowledgement that the principal wasn't someone who would let something like this slide. Mrs. Carmichael, however, seemed unfazed. She moved through her day as though nothing had happened, teaching her classes with her usual clipped efficiency. When a couple of students in her morning class gave her questioning looks, she simply raised an eyebrow and continued with her lesson, daring them to say anything. By the time the meeting was called that afternoon, the tension had reached a boiling point. The school board representatives, the superintendent, and a handful of key staff members gathered in the conference room, their faces set in grim determination. Brandon's dad sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding. His usual warmth was replaced by a calm intensity, the kind that demanded attention without raising his voice. Mrs. Carmichael walked in last, her heels clicking on the tile floor. She carried herself with an air of confidence, as though this were just another routine meeting. But as she took her seat and caught the principal's gaze, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Thank you all for being here," Brandon's dad began, his voice even and professional. "We're here to address a situation that occurred in this school yesterday. As educators, we have a responsibility to create a safe and respectful environment for our students, and when that standard is not met, it's our duty to address it." He turned his attention to Mrs. Carmichael, his tone unwavering. "Mrs. Carmichael, would you like to explain your actions during third period yesterday?" She shifted in her seat, her composure faltering for the first time. I was addressing a disciplinary issue," she said, her voice defensive. "Brandon's appearance was disruptive, and I was trying to make a point about the importance of presentation. And you believed using a glue stick on his hair was an appropriate way to make that point?" he asked, his tone still calm but with an edge that made the room feel smaller. "It was not my intention to harm him," she said quickly, her face flushing. "I was trying to teach him a lesson about accountability. Perhaps I could have handled it differently, but I stand by my belief that discipline is necessary." There was a heavy silence in the room, the weight of her words hanging in the air. One of the board members finally spoke up, her voice firm. "Mrs. Carmichael, discipline is not an excuse for humiliation. What you did was not only unprofessional but deeply inappropriate." Brandon's dad leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Our job as educators is to uplift our students, not to tear them down. Brandon was humiliated in front of his peers, and that is unacceptable. This isn't just about one incident, it's about the culture we're creating in this school. We need to be better." Mrs. Carmichael opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of her actions. Her confidence wavered, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been regret. The meeting stretched on, diving into policy discussions and potential consequences. Brandon's dad didn't relent, his resolve unwavering as he fought for accountability and change. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. But as the staff filed out of the room, Mrs. Carmichael lingered behind. She approached Brandon's dad hesitantly, her voice low. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her tone soft. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Intentions matter, Mrs. Carmichael, but so do actions. And actions have consequences." Back at home, Brandon waited anxiously for his dad to return. When the front door finally opened and he heard his dad's footsteps, he jumped up from the couch, his heart pounding. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice filled with both hope and trepidation. His dad set down his briefcase and gave Brandon a reassuring smile. "It's being handled," he said. "Mrs. Carmichael won't be teaching for the rest of the week while we investigate further. But more importantly, I want you to know how proud I am of you." Brandon blinked, surprised. "Proud of me? For what?" "For the way you handled yourself," his dad said. "You stayed calm and respectful, even when you were treated unfairly. That takes strength." Brandon felt a lump rise in his throat, and for the first time in what felt like days, the tightness in his chest began to ease. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't alone. His dad was in his corner, and that made all the difference. As the evening settled in, Brandon sat by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He didn't know how things would play out at school or what the other kids would say when he returned, but he was beginning to realize that standing up for himself and for what was right was more important than what anyone else thought. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, a quiet determination took root in his heart. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Brandon knew he had the strength to face whatever came next. Brandon's return to school the following week felt like stepping into a storm. The hallways buzzed with quiet conversations that paused whenever he walked by. Some kids gave him sympathetic smiles, others avoided eye contact altogether. But the most unsettling part was the way a few of Mrs. Carmichael's staunchest defenders whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "He probably exaggerated it," one girl muttered to her friend. "You know how some people love playing the victim." Brandon clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep walking. His dad's words about staying calm echoed in his mind, but it was harder than he thought to ignore the weight of all those stares. By the time he reached his first class, his heart was pounding, and he could feel a flush creeping up his neck. The day dragged on, every minute feeling heavier than the last. He noticed some teachers looking at him a little differently, either with pity or a forced neutrality that made it clear they knew about what had happened. His classmates were no better. While some whispered about him behind his back, others asked outright, "Did she really glue your hair? Like, for real?" Brandon wasn't sure which was worse, the constant questions or the judgmental silence. Either way, it made him feel small, like he was being reduced to a single moment in a room full of eyes. He wanted to scream that he was more than what had happened, but no words came. By lunchtime, Brandon decided he couldn't take the cafeteria. He grabbed his tray and headed outside to eat alone, hoping the crisp fall air would help clear his head. He found a quiet spot near the edge of the schoolyard, under a tree where he could sit and breathe without feeling like he was on display. He'd barely taken a bite of his sandwich when he heard footsteps crunching on the grass behind him. Turning, he saw two boys from his math class approaching, their faces unreadable. For a second, his stomach dropped, thinking they'd come to tease him, but then one of them spoke. "Hey, Brandon," the taller boy said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "We just wanted to say. That was messed up, what she did. Nobody deserves that." The other boy nodded. "Yeah, man. It's not cool how some people are acting like it's no big deal. We just wanted you to know we've got your back." Brandon blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected anyone to defend him, let alone come out here to tell him so. "Thanks," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." They stayed for a few minutes, talking about the math test coming up and how awful cafeteria pizza was, before heading back inside. As Brandon watched them go, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. Maybe not everyone was against him after all. But the respite didn't last long. That afternoon, the school held an emergency assembly, with all the students and teachers packed into the auditorium. Brandon's dad stood at the podium, his expression serious as he addressed the crowd. "We are here today to talk about respect," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "Respect for ourselves, respect for each other, and respect for the responsibility we all share in creating a safe and supportive environment." He spoke about the importance of accountability, about how every student and staff member had a role to play in fostering kindness and understanding. As he spoke, Brandon felt a mix of pride and anxiety. He admired his dad's ability to command a room, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was looking at him, even though his name wasn't mentioned. When his dad finished, the auditorium erupted into polite applause. But as the students filed out, the whispers began again. "Do you think she'll get fired?" someone asked. "I heard she's trying to fight it," another replied. The tension in the air was palpable, and Brandon could feel it following him like a shadow. By the time the final bell rang, he was exhausted. He headed home, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The uncertainty of what would come next gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. The next morning, the school was abuzz with news. Mrs. Carmichael had been called into another meeting, this time with the district superintendent and the school board. Rumors flew like wildfire, with some claiming she was on the verge of being fired and others insisting she was going to fight back, arguing that her actions had been misinterpreted. Brandon tried to stay out of it, focusing on his classes and keeping his head down. But during lunch, one of the school's office assistants approached him with a note. "Your dad needs to see you in his office," she said, her tone kind but firm. His heart sank as he made his way to the principal's office, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When he walked in, he found his dad sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Carmichael was there too, sitting stiffly in one of the chairs, her face pale and tight. "Brandon," his dad said, gesturing for him to sit. "We've been discussing the incident from last week, and Mrs. Carmichael has something she'd like to say." Brandon's stomach churned as he sat down, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. He looked at Mrs. Carmichael, whose gaze flickered between him and his dad. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "I want to apologize," Mrs. Carmichael said finally, her voice tight but sincere. "What I did was wrong. I acted out of frustration, and I didn't think about how it would affect you. I'm truly sorry." Brandon didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to accept her apology, to move on and let this all be over. But another part of him, the part that still felt the sting of humiliation, wasn't ready to forgive so easily. He looked at his dad, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "You hurt me," Brandon said quietly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It wasn't just about the glue, it was how you made me feel, like I wasn't worth respecting. But I appreciate you saying sorry." Mrs. Carmichael nodded, her expression a mix of relief and regret. Brandon's dad spoke next, his tone firm. "This apology is a start, but it doesn't erase what happened. We'll be taking steps to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again to Brandon or to any other student." As the meeting ended and Brandon left the office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The conflict wasn't over, not entirely, but for the first time, he felt like things were moving in the right direction. The tension wasn't gone, but there was a glimmer of resolution on the horizon. And as he walked back to class, he couldn't help but feel a quiet determination building inside him. As Brandon walked back to class, he couldn't shake the feeling that the apology had been too easy, too neat. Something about Mrs. Carmichael's demeanor nagged at him. Her tight-lipped regret seemed more about the consequences than genuine understanding. But he brushed it aside, telling himself it didn't matter. She had apologized, his dad had promised change, and he wanted to move forward. The rest of the week passed in a blur. People were still talking, but the buzz was starting to die down. Brandon noticed fewer whispers and sidelong glances, and while some of his classmates still asked awkward questions, most of them moved on to new gossip. He found himself relaxing, slowly feeling like he could breathe again. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. Brandon was in the middle of history class when the door opened, and a woman he didn't recognize walked in. She was sharply dressed, with a no-nonsense air that immediately commanded attention. The teacher paused mid-sentence, her face pale as the woman handed her a note. "Brandon," the teacher said, her voice trembling slightly, "you need to go with her." The room fell silent. Brandon's stomach twisted as he gathered his things and followed the woman out. He didn't ask where they were going. Her clipped stride and tense expression told him enough. Something was wrong. She led him to an unfamiliar conference room near the administrative offices. Inside, his dad sat at the table, his face tight with anger. Across from him was a man Brandon recognized as one of the district's senior administrators. And next to the man, to Brandon's shock, sat Mrs. Carmichael. "Have a seat, Brandon," the administrator said, gesturing to the chair beside his dad. Brandon hesitated, his heart pounding, before sitting down. He glanced at his dad, but his father's expression was unreadable. "We've asked you here because new information has come to light regarding last week's incident," the administrator began, his tone measured. "Mrs. Carmichael has raised concerns about discrepancies in the account of what happened." Brandon blinked, his mind racing to process what he'd just heard. "Discrepancies?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Yes," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice calmer now, almost smug. "I've been advised to clarify that the events were misrepresented. I never intended to harm you, Brandon. I used the glue to fix the tear in your notebook and accidentally got some on your hair. It was an unfortunate mistake, not malicious." Brandon stared at her, his disbelief quickly giving way to anger. "That's not true," he said, his voice shaking. "You did it on purpose." "You were mad at me, and you, Brandon," the administrator interrupted, holding up a hand. "We're not here to place blame. We're here to ensure that all parties are heard and that the truth is established." Brandon looked at his dad, hoping for support, but his father's expression remained carefully neutral. "Brandon," his dad said gently, "tell us exactly what happened, from your perspective." Brandon took a deep breath, recounting the events in as much detail as he could. He described how Mrs. Carmichael had singled him out, her frustration escalating until she reached for the glue. He told them how humiliated he'd felt, how the other kids had laughed, how she hadn't apologized until she was forced to. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Mrs. Carmichael spoke, her tone icy. "I admit I was frustrated, but I would never intentionally humiliate a student. If anything, Brandon's behavior that day contributed to the misunderstanding." Brandon's dad's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, the administrator cut in. "We'll need to review this further before making any determinations," he said. "Brandon, thank you for sharing your perspective. You're free to go back to class." Brandon wanted to argue, to demand that someone believe him, but the look on his dad's face told him it was better to leave. As he walked out, he heard the murmured voices of the adults behind him, their words indistinct but heavy with tension. Back in class, Brandon couldn't focus. His mind replayed the meeting over and over, each detail fueling his frustration. Mrs. Carmichael was lying, twisting the truth to save herself, and now it felt like she might actually get away with it. When the final bell rang, Brandon headed straight to his dad's office, determined to get answers. But when he walked in, he found his dad pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand," his dad was saying, his tone clipped. "But this is about more than policy. It's about integrity." He paused, listening, then sighed. "I'll handle it. Thank you." He hung up and turned to Brandon, his face weary but resolute. "I know you're upset," he said before Brandon could speak. "And I'm doing everything I can to make this right. But this is bigger than just us now. The district is involved, and they're trying to protect their reputation." "Protect their reputation?" Brandon said, his voice rising. "What about me? What about the truth?" His dad stepped closer, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get there," he said firmly. "But it's going to take time. You have to trust me." Brandon nodded reluctantly, but the anger and frustration still churned in his chest. He wanted to trust his dad, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He'd been silent long enough. If the adults weren't going to stand up for him, he'd have to find another way to make his voice heard. Brandon woke up the next morning with a sense of determination. He knew he couldn't let Mrs. Carmichael rewrite the truth. Her carefully constructed story made him feel invisible, as if his experience didn't matter. It wasn't just about what happened to him anymore, it was about standing up for what was right. He decided it was time to act. During lunch, Brandon quietly gathered a few of his classmates who had been in the room during the incident. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start, but then he spoke, his voice steady despite the nerves. He explained what was happening and asked if anyone remembered what really happened that day. To his relief, several of them nodded. One of his classmates said, "I saw her face, Brandon. She wasn't just frustrated, she was angry. And I remember her saying something about teaching you a lesson before she grabbed the glue." Another chimed in, "Yeah, she didn't look sorry when it happened. She just stood there while everyone laughed." Brandon felt a surge of hope. "Would you guys be willing to tell the truth if they ask you?" he asked, his voice earnest. There was a moment of silence, and then they agreed. That evening, Brandon told his dad what he had done. His father's expression softened, a mix of pride and concern. "You're brave, son," he said. "But you need to be ready for pushback. The system doesn't always make it easy for the truth to come out." The following day, Brandon and his classmates were called into another meeting. This time, the atmosphere was different. The district administrator seemed uneasy, glancing between Mrs. Carmichael and the students. Brandon's dad sat at the end of the table, his expression calm but watchful. One by one, Brandon's classmates spoke, recounting what they had seen. They described Mrs. Carmichael's anger, her words, and her actions, painting a clear picture of what had really happened. The room grew tense as their testimonies unraveled Mrs. Carmichael's story. Mrs. Carmichael tried to interrupt, her voice defensive. "These are children, they could be misremembering or exaggerating," she said, her face flushed. But the administrator held up a hand. "Mrs. Carmichael, we've heard enough. This isn't just about their accounts. We've also reviewed the security footage from the hallway outside the classroom." Brandon's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't even considered the possibility of footage. The administrator continued, "While the cameras don't capture audio, they do show the sequence of events. It's clear that you reached for the glue and moved deliberately toward Brandon. There's no indication that this was an accident." Mrs. Carmichael's face paled, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Then she stammered, "I was under stress that day. It wasn't my intention to hurt him." "That may be true," the administrator said firmly, "but your actions were inappropriate and unprofessional. We have a duty to protect our students, and this behavior cannot be overlooked." Brandon felt a weight lift off his chest as the administrator's words sank in. Finally, someone was holding her accountable. But just as he started to relax, the administrator turned to him. "Brandon, I want to commend you for speaking up and encouraging others to do the same. However, I also need to address an important issue. After reviewing the footage, we noticed that during another moment in the day, you appeared to be mocking Mrs. Carmichael with your friends. Do you remember this?" Brandon froze. He racked his brain, trying to recall what the administrator was talking about. Then it hit him, he and a few classmates had been joking about her strictness earlier that day. He hadn't meant any harm, but he realized now how it might have looked. "I didn't mean to mock her," he said honestly. "We were just joking around." The administrator nodded. "I appreciate your honesty. While it doesn't excuse Mrs. Carmichael's actions, it's important to remember that respect goes both ways." Brandon nodded, understanding the lesson but still feeling a twinge of guilt. In the end, the district decided to suspend Mrs. Carmichael and require her to attend professional development training before considering her return to teaching. It wasn't the harshest consequence, but it was enough to make it clear that her behavior wouldn't be tolerated. As Brandon and his dad walked out of the meeting, his father put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, son," he said. "It takes courage to stand up for the truth, even when it's hard." Brandon smiled, feeling a sense of relief and pride. But just as they reached the car, his dad's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the superintendent," he said, answering the call. Brandon watched as his dad's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. Are you sure? His dad said, his voice low. After a moment, he hung up and turned to Brandon, his face serious. They're launching a full review of the school's disciplinary policies, he said. It seems this wasn't the first complaint about Mrs. Carmichael. There might be more to this than we thought. Brandon's relief was replaced by a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The conflict he thought was over might just be the beginning of something bigger. As he climbed into the car, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered and what it would take to finally bring them all to light. In the days that followed the meeting, the atmosphere at the school shifted. Whispers filled the hallways as students and staff alike discussed the fallout of Mrs. Carmichael's actions. Some students, emboldened by Brandon's courage, began sharing their own stories about moments when they felt unheard or mistreated. It wasn't long before a larger picture began to form. Mrs. Carmichael's incident was not an isolated one. There were accounts of sharp comments, unfair treatment, and moments of dismissiveness that had left quiet marks on other students over the years. Brandon's dad, now fully aware of the scope of the situation, decided to act. As the principal, he knew his role came with responsibility, and he couldn't let these revelations fade into silence. He organized an open forum for students and parents, creating a space where they could voice their concerns and experiences. It was an unprecedented move, and while some were hesitant, others saw it as an opportunity for real change. At the forum, Brandon found himself sitting near the back, observing as others stepped forward to speak. A girl from his class talked about how she had been embarrassed in front of her peers during a lesson. Another boy described how he often felt singled out because of how he dressed. Each story carried its own weight, and with every word spoken, the collective understanding in the room deepened. When it was Brandon's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment before standing up. The room grew quiet as he walked to the front, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at his dad, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. I didn't expect all of this to happen, Brandon began, his voice steady but quiet. When I decided to speak up, I was just trying to tell the truth about what happened to me. But hearing all of you share your stories, I realized this is about more than just me. It's about making sure everyone feels safe and respected here. The room erupted in applause, and Brandon felt a surge of pride. It wasn't easy to put his feelings into words, but he knew they resonated with the people around him. As the forum continued, Brandon's dad made a promise to the community. He committed to reviewing the school's policies and training programs to ensure incidents like this wouldn't happen again. He also announced plans to implement regular discussions between students and staff to foster better understanding and communication. For Brandon, life slowly returned to normal, though it was clear things weren't exactly the same. Teachers seemed more thoughtful in their interactions with students, and the atmosphere in the classrooms felt lighter. His classmates treated him with a newfound respect, recognizing the courage it had taken to stand up for what was right. One afternoon, Brandon found himself alone in the art room, working on a project for class. As he carefully painted, he heard a voice behind him. That's really good, someone said. Turning around, he saw one of the younger teachers, Ms. Rivera, smiling at his work. Thanks, Brandon said, setting down his brush. Ms. Rivera hesitated before speaking again. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. It's not easy to speak up, especially when you're up against someone in authority. You reminded all of us that we need to do better. Brandon smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. I didn't do it alone, he said. A lot of people helped me. She nodded. Still, you were brave. And sometimes, that's what it takes to make a real difference. As the weeks turned into months, Brandon began to see the impact of his actions in ways he hadn't anticipated. The school hosted workshops on empathy and inclusivity, led by experts who encouraged students and staff to think critically about their roles in creating a positive environment. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary, and slowly, a sense of progress began to take root. Mrs. Carmichael's suspension eventually ended, but she didn't return to the school. Brandon heard through the grapevine that she had decided to retire early, choosing to step away from teaching altogether. It was a quiet exit, and while some students expressed relief, others hoped she had taken the time to reflect and grow. For Brandon, the journey wasn't just about what happened in that classroom. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for himself and inspiring others to do the same. He learned that change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single voice willing to speak the truth. Years later, as Brandon walked across the stage at his high school graduation, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The road had been anything but smooth, but it had shaped him into someone who understood the power of resilience and the importance of community. As the crowd cheered and he accepted his diploma, he caught his dad's eye in the audience. His father gave him a proud smile, and in that moment, Brandon knew they had both come a long way. The lessons of that year stayed with Brandon as he moved forward in life. He carried them into college, into friendships, and into every challenge he faced. And while the incident with Mrs. Carmichael was a chapter he wouldn't soon forget, it was also a reminder that even in moments of struggle, there is an opportunity to grow, to connect, and to create something better.